Thanks very much, Kathy. And it's a delight to be talking to you today. As co-chair with Simone Veronese of the Congress in Helsinki next year, we're working really hard with our committee and with a range of people to try and construct a really exciting, vibrant programme for all of you. And of course, a big part of that is your work. It's the abstracts that you are going to be submitting or possibly even have already submitted for the EAPC Congress. And so what we wanted to do today was to give you some hints and tips. Now, it was badged as how to review abstracts for the EAPC, and we're certainly going to be talking about that. But I've added in brackets and write, because I know from the questions that some of you have already put forwards that you are as interested today in how to write great abstracts as you are on reviewing abstracts. And of course, the two are intimately intertwined because a really great abstract is very much straightforward to review. And of course, what we want are your understanding of what we're looking for, which of course affects both writing and of course reviewing. So, writing. Writing is the key skill that will enable you to put and to produce a really strong abstract that we're going to be delighted to choose for the EAPC Congress this year or potentially some in the future. Because what we want, as I've said, is a really vibrant Congress. And just imagine that this is you in front of a room of really interested people wanting to know a little bit more about your work and how it really is going to contribute to our field of palliative care. So I want you to visualize this as we're going through, because this is what we want. Really great abstracts, really well reviewed, really well received. So I'm going to break it down a little bit more into some of its component parts, and then I'm going to talk about how we want our reviewers to look at those component parts as part of the scoring and reviewing process that will happen a little bit later in the year. So what do we all start with? Well, of course, actually, for many of us, it starts with great research. And I know that sounds very straightforward and easy to say, but in fact, it's really almost impossible to craft a winning abstract if you haven't underpinned it, if it's a research abstract, more on that in the next slide, if you haven't done really great research. So you need to have asked a really good research question, one which of course is worth answering and which our audience at the EAPC Congress are interested in hearing the answers to. You've got to address it with the right research design. You have to have collected your data well, and you have to have analysed it expertly so that you can put across the findings of your research and people can be sure that it is a good piece of research. But of course, I want to say here that not all the abstracts that we accept for the EAPs are research abstracts. This is our main congress, not our research congress. So we're also interested in abstracts which address a broader range of issues. So we have what we've called non-empirical abstracts. And if you look, and I'll show you the link later, at our abstract submission site and our abstract instructions, you will see that there's a whole space for you to submit these abstracts. This might be, for example, a new clinical initiative that you've been involved with, a new way of providing services. I don't know, the sky's the limit, really. But what I would say in terms of submitting this as an abstract to the conference and to have it scored highly, really we want something that has been evaluated. So whilst you might have started a new service, for example, which you think people would be really interested in finding out about, and I'm sure they will be interested in finding out about it, what would be even more meaningful for our participants is if you can tell people what the impact of that service was. Because of course, people only want to put into place new initiatives, whatever they may be, that perhaps have some evidence of effect. So I'm going to encourage you now and for the future that if you're thinking of submitting one of those sorts of abstracts, you need to plan early on how to evaluate the impact of a new intervention or service from the start, so that you can then present some data, perhaps on quality of life or attendances or, I don't know, whatever you're evaluating, so that we actually have some of those data to assess the impact of your service. And much later on, when we talk about how we assess some of those abstracts, you'll see that playing out a little bit more in the evaluation structure that we have built in. So again, just a reminder then that for the EAPC, there are two forms of abstracts that can be submitted for the conference in Helsinki next year. Research abstracts and what we've called non-empirical abstracts that could look at a range of things, but where we really are encouraging you to submit things where there are some evaluative data to support an understanding of the effectiveness of that new intervention. I also want to encourage you to start to think about your abstract as a narrative, as a story. Of course, it's not a once upon a time story, but you should think of it as having a really clear narrative arc. You get a very limited number of words to present an abstract. So this year we have 300 words. That is your limit for writing an abstract. 300 words is not very many words. Try and put too much into that from different perspectives and different elements, perhaps of a complex project, and you are going to struggle to enable the reader, and by reader perhaps we mean reviewer to begin with, to understand the purpose and message of your abstract. That's not to say that we want you to dumb anything down. It's not to say that we're not interested in seeing your perhaps mixed methods projects or complex multi-component projects, but you have to think about how you are going to put those across in a way that is clear to the reader, where there is a straightforward message and relevant and related conclusions. And again, you'll see later when we start to look at the scoring system, it's surprising perhaps as a reviewer how many of these abstracts have a conclusion that you think, I'm not sure that's based on what they have presented as the findings perhaps within the abstract. So do really think about your messaging from the title through the entirety of the abstract so that it's clear to the reader what the purpose of that abstract is focused on. What we want you to avoid is this mess of threads where there are multiple messages which are disconnected. Multiple messages is fine. I am not saying no to multiple messages, but it is when they are disconnected from the background, helping the reader to understand why this work has been done, the aim of the work, how you've studied it, and what you found. And as I've just said, often we'll see conclusions perhaps unrelated to the findings presented. They're perhaps not bad recommendations, but we can't see easily that they have come from the work that you have done. So again, it's that elegant clarity that will help you to get a really high scoring abstract. So I'm going to start with the title. And again, as a reviewer, the title is the first thing that you will see in the abstract reviewing system. So that title is really important, both for you writing an abstract and potentially for you assessing the abstract. It already cues you in to what this abstract is going to be about. So when you are writing your abstract, think about the title as your shop front. It has to entice the reader in. They have to look at it and think, oh, this looks interesting. I'm looking forward to reading this abstract. And when obviously it's hopefully accepted and you're presenting the work, that title will draw people into your session. They'll go, well, that's fascinating. I really want to go and hear them talk about this work. So it has to be clear and unambiguous. Think about the key words that might tell the reader what your abstract is about. So we know this is a palliative care conference. You probably don't have to work that in too much to the title. Although, as we'll see later, it is important that you make your work relevant to palliative care, and that should be explicit. But if, for example, you're doing some work on, I don't know, I can't think of a good example. Well, COPD, because I know I'm going to present some examples about that in a moment. Clearly, you're going to have to put something about COPD in the title. You might want to put something in the title that actually reflects the focus of the work. So is it about service development? Is it about breathlessness? Is it about etc.? So think about how you're going to cue the reader in to what this is going to be about. I would suggest it's really helpful to put some design information into the title, because again, that cues the reader in. You have different expectations of the content of an abstract, which is, for example, a phenomenological study, to one which might be a cohort study or a trial. So cue the reader in. And unless you absolutely have to, because of the nature of your study, I would suggest that you avoid country names. Your study will probably have been conducted in a single country. That is absolutely fine. Some of them might be multi-country, some of them might be just one part of a particular country. That doesn't matter, because you need to contextualize your work for a reader from, as we have in this webinar today, all over the world. If you write that your project is based in the UK, where I'm sitting right now, or in Jordan, or in Belgium, or wherever it may well be, you are probably saying to your reader, and this might only be interesting for people who are in Jordan, the UK, or Belgium. Write it to be relevant to our really international audience, because that will attract people to the session when you're presenting it, will also enhance the scoring of the abstract in terms of its broad relevance outside of your own setting, if you can truly make those claims and conclusions, obviously. So sometimes we write the title last and really quite rapidly. And what I'm suggesting to you is, fine, write it last, but please don't write it rapidly, because it's your shop front and it can put somebody off when they are reviewing your abstract right from the very beginning. Next, let's have a think about the background. And essentially, I've conceptualized this as 3 questions that you probably want to address. First, what do we know? Second, what don't we know? And third, and really quite importantly, but rarely addressed, why do we want to know it? And I'll give some examples later of how you might address some of that when writing an abstract. You only have 300 words. you have to write this in a very succinct manner to get a lot of information across with a relatively few number of words. But when you are writing those, clearly you can write about more than one of these. This is not a sentence. This is not 3 sentences to address this in the background. This is usually perhaps 2 sentences that incorporates this information into the sentence. And it is really important for most readers to base this on evidence that exists, the gap in the evidence, and why we need to fill it. Often in the background, we'll make some sort of policy type statement about the importance of this area. And of course, if you were writing a full paper, you probably would write a paragraph about that. It's not that that is unimportant when you're crafting some information. You might have a slide about it if if you get an oral presentation. But I'm suggesting that there probably isn't space for an awful lot of that within a very tightly written abstract. So let's think about this background. And as I say, throughout this, I've stripped some examples on people with COPD. And apologies for those who came to see me talk when we were in Barcelona, because I have used some of these slides before, but you'll be glad to know I've added a lot of extra content as well. So here we are. I've put it as 3 sentences here. But if I was actually then refining this to submit, I would probably start to reduce this and get rid of some of the words. And the reason I'm saying this is because you need to give yourself time to edit and refine this. Writing 300 words feels like it's something that you should be able to do quite quickly, but actually you will need to work on this, to revise this, to craft it, to show it to other people, to get their feedback, to write this in the best possible way. So here are 3 examples of what we know. People with advanced COPD are frequently admitted to hospital. What don't we know? We don't really know how to reduce the avoidable admissions. And why do we want to know it? Because people don't want to be in hospital if at all possible. So again, one of your tasks perhaps afterwards for your own abstract is to think, how can I write this? And then how can I refine it to use fewer words? Combine some of the things without making complex multi-clause sentences that are very difficult to follow. Because that is the other thing I would absolutely advise you not to do as a reader. If somebody has tried to crush too much into a single sentence, you have to read it 3 or 4 times to make sense of that sentence. And actually that is going to put your reviewer off because you haven't crafted it or spent enough time crafting it to be clear about what you want to put across. Let's think then about the methods. Now for an abstract, you have a simple heading that says something like methods or design. And so within that, though, you want to make sure that you are putting across sufficient information for the reader to understand what you have done, and more importantly, to understand that this is a robust, well-designed, well-executed study. Because clearly what people want to see presented is a robust, well-designed, well-executed study. So these are the sorts of things that you might want to see if you could weave in to your methods section. I would certainly say you need a statement of the overarching design of the study. You want to tell them something about the population, the setting, how you've sampled and recruited people. There are some things that are only relevant for particular designs. So here I have, as an example, thought, well, okay, if this was a trial, I would have to write something, for example, about the intervention that's being tested. If this is a non-empirical study and you want to tell people about what you've done, you're going to have to tell them about the intervention. You're going to have to say a little bit of how about data were collected, how you've analysed it, and particularly if there were any important ethical issues that you needed to address. Again, you're looking at and thinking, Catherine, you have lost the plot here. I only have 300 words. How am I going to get all of this information into just 300 words? Well, again, these were just something I developed quickly, but here are some examples of how you could address all of those within a relatively few number of words. So here I've started off with one sentence, a randomized controlled trial with people with advanced COPD in acute hospitals. So there I have ticked off design, population and setting all in one relatively straightforward, succinct sentence. So what I'm saying here, and again, I'm sure if you look at this, you could refine some of this language. But what I'm saying is you can address each one of these elements often within a single sentence. So think about it. So again, here I've addressed sampling and recruitment in one sentence. So I've told you here it's a trial, so we are randomly sampling people, but I've told you something about what it is we're interested in being admitted in the past 48 hours. So again, have a think about how you are putting across the key critical information for your particular study so people can grasp what has happened relatively straightforwardly. So I've given another example for my random qualitative study. In this instance, I've decided it's going to be grounded theory. So again, you can see I've clearly changed the beginning. It's very clear now that it's a grounded theory study, but the rest of the sentence remains the same or similar. But again, we've now moved on to a different description of sampling. In this instance, it's purposive and theoretical. Again, the population is still the same. You're going to need to add in some information about the semi-structured interviews or unstructured interviews or whatever form of data collection it was. And where I've put ... clearly you have to put something very succinctly on the purpose or focus of the interviews. So again, I hope you can see from these examples that within a relatively few number of sentences, you can actually address many of the critical elements of methods that you will want to put into a review, into an abstract. And I think that's really important because often when people see methods, they write one or possibly two sentences that do not always address as many elements of the information that we know that if we were writing a paper, for example, we would want to put in the methods section. So again, crafting these in a way that only takes 300 words in total takes time. And I'm certainly going to encourage you to take some time to do that for the highest possible quality of abstract. Again, think about the results. This is one of the key things that people are going to look at. And you can see that again when you look at the abstract scoring system that I'll show you in a minute. So make sure that the reader understands how many people took part, who took part, what did you actually find? Is there anything you need to know to help the reader to interpret those results? And here in my brackets, I've put something that we commonly see. There were three main themes. And as a reader or as a reviewer, I'm saying, well, what were those three main themes? What were they? They're sometimes not even named. So I would say it's really important to make sure that you give yourself sufficient words within the abstract to at least name your main findings. And ideally, and brackets can be your friend here, to put in a few words if they're not immediately obvious what they are, to help the reader to understand what you're saying within that. So again, here's my obviously entirely fictional study that I'm engaged with at the moment. So people with COPD. put in a number, and here I is intervention and C is control of how many people were in each arm of the study. And again, I've put this in this format because these are shorthand ways of putting across quite a number of pieces of information in a very succinct manner. So if you write that out as a narrative, 249 people with COPD took part in the study. Okay, I have added took part in the study. That's 3 words or 4 words, I can't count. So that you don't need to add. So n equals 249. Most reviewers will understand that means the number of people who took part in the study. If it's a trial, most reviewers will understand that I is intervention and C is control. And what they'll see from this is it was a little bit unbalanced, slightly more people in intervention than in control. Here, I've not made my fictional difference too large, but if it is much larger than that, they'll want to understand why. And perhaps if it was deliberately unbalanced, think, oh, I should have told them that in the methods, so they'll understand that. Here you can see how many women, what their mean age were, what the range was. So again, think about the critical pieces of information, because actually age might be irrelevant for your study, but some other descriptor could be. So it's not that I'm necessarily saying that you have to give information on age, but you have to think, what are the key pieces of information that I need to get across, ideally for the reviewer to be able to interpret my findings. Again, if you've told us that the key outcome is rates of readmission, then tell us what the rates of readmission were. And again, make sure that you give that comparative data with, where relevant, confidence intervals or p-values or whatever it is that you need to put across to ensure that the reader understands. I've put with a question mark here results from secondary outcomes, because if it may well be important, and if you are offered a poster or a presentation, you might choose to put in some information about those secondary outcomes. But there's an interesting question about that golden thread, that narrative arc, that makes me think, if you don't have space to put those in and for it to be meaningful, that's one example where you might choose to say, do you know what? I'm just going to look at the primary outcome here, because that is the key, critical, important message from this abstract. If it's not the key, critical, important message from the abstract, then you need to think about how you've described the study and make sure that you have described, for example, your data collection for the secondary outcomes in order for those to make sense. So again, it's that thread. If you've not mentioned data collection for the secondary outcomes in the methods, and suddenly they pop up in the results, it's going to be very confusing to the reviewer. So it's about thinking about that congruence as you work your way through. So again, here's my example for my mythical grounded theory study. Clearly here we have fewer participants. It's a qualitative in-depth study. You may or may not want to put in some of this information about sex or age. Again, the same points about other important characteristics. Here it's a grounded theory study, so you are expecting potentially a theory of something, I don't know what you might call it, was developed. And here you could say that you developed a theory of whatever, and then name some of the elements of that theory with some description, so that it's very clear what the substance of those findings were, but it's also clear to the reader that what you have presented is a robust grounded theory study. You followed the methods of grounded theory when you were talking about the methods, and you have presented the results of your grounded theory, or whatever it may well be, in a way that is clearly congruent with a grounded theory approach. So each method or design of research has its own language, concepts for some, themes for others. Get those mixed up, and the astute reviewer is going to say, oh, That's not the language that's normally used with grounded theory or cohort studies or whatever it may well be. So by using the right language succinctly, you are demonstrating your understanding of the approach that you have said that you're going to be using. And that's really super important, because that mismatch is going to cause confusion in the reader and is probably going to result in your abstract being marked down, because there isn't this congruence, and the reader is starting to think, perhaps this isn't as robust a study as I might have originally thought. So again, think really carefully about the language that you're using within your abstract. Then going on to conclusions. And the most important thing here that a lot of people get wrong is restating the findings. The conclusions are not a summary of the findings. You probably only have 1 or 2 sentences for the conclusions, but it should be an actual conclusion, perhaps a recommendation. It should be clearly based on the impact of the given results. Remember, all the reader or reviewer in this instance can see is your findings that you have presented within the abstract. They can't see your full paper that you've got in preparation. They can't see what's in your head either. They can only see what you have concluded and what you said you had found on the basis of what you said you had done. So it's got to be clearly based on the impact of those given results. Again, it's that golden thread, isn't it, working its way through. If you give a conclusion that the reader cannot see is based on what you've already said, they're going to, again, think that you are not clear about what you are saying or what is the important impact of your work. And I would entirely recommend that you do need to make sure throughout this that it is relevant to the policy, practice or theory of palliative care, because when we look at the scoring system in a moment, you'll see that's one of the elements that reviewers will be scoring your work on. So let's go on to thinking about this conference in particular and about reviewing for this conference. But I hope you'll see the absolute connection between what I've just been talking about in terms of how you might construct an abstract and what you might be looking for when you are reviewing an abstract. So this is the submission website. This is what it looks like. And I've put a reminder there that the deadline is absolutely the 31st of October. No extensions, no changes. That will be it. Just to reassure, for those of you who have either volunteered to be reviewers or who are thinking of being a reviewer, 2 things. Firstly, reviewing abstracts is super helpful for when you write your next abstracts, because you will have been exposed to a wide range of styles of abstract writing and will start to understand a little bit more about what puts across that information in the best way. The second thing I'd say is it is absolutely fine to both be a reviewer and to submit abstracts. In fact, I would say probably getting on for 100% of our reviewers are also submitting abstracts to the conference. We have very clear protocols and sort of barriers in place so that you or anyone that has a conflict with your work will not be reviewing your abstract. So please don't worry. You won't get your own abstract to review, and neither will your colleagues. But of course, we're not foolproof. We do ask you to declare if you have any conflicts of interest and to pass assessing that abstract on to somebody else. But just to absolutely reinforce that being a reviewer is, I think, a really great learning experience. It also means that we get the best possible quality, because the more reviewers we have, the more reviewers we can have per abstract, because each of them are reviewed more than once. And so we iron out some of those inherent biases that we all have, perhaps towards particular types of work. So, as I've just intimated, each abstract is scored multiple times, ideally at least 3, but because we are expanding our pool of reviewers, we actually hope that each of them will be reviewed more than 3 times, because we average out the scores when we look at this overall scores for the abstract. So of course we just want to, there are some reviewers that are perhaps harsher scorers than others, some who are more generous. The more reviews we get per abstract, then the more that natural difference is evened out, and we'll be able to see more clearly which are really the great abstracts. It's not a hugely onerous task. I was looking back at the abstracts that I was allocated last year as a reviewer, and I think I reviewed perhaps 10 or 15 abstracts. So we're not talking about days and days of work, but then neither are we talking about you just getting 1 or 2 abstracts to review. Everyone is allocated as much as we can, the same number of abstracts to review. We try and spread it evenly across all the reviewers. And perhaps it's an afternoon's work, something like that. We're not talking about something that's going to take, weeks and weeks of your time. We're talking perhaps about something where you can settle down with a cup of coffee, and perhaps it's an afternoon's work, for which, of course, we'll be very grateful. We really are looking for people from a range of countries, a range of backgrounds, a range of experiences. Lots of people say, oh, I couldn't be a reviewer. I haven't got the expertise or the knowledge. Well, we're trying to capture people with that really broad range of expertise and knowledge and balance it out across. So I should imagine everyone who has come to the webinar today will have something to give as a reviewer. And if you've not already signed up, I would really encourage you to do that. What are we aiming for? Well, of course, as I said right at the beginning, we are aiming to choose the highest quality of abstracts, which are robust and original. Because what we want to do as a scientific committee is to create a balanced programme for the conference that meets a huge range of needs. And we can see when we look at the list of attendees for previous conferences that that range is huge. So we have people who are clinicians, we have people who are researchers, we have people who are policymakers, we have people who perhaps fit into all of those categories. And they each come with different things that they're interested in. Some are only interested in oncology, some COPD, my random example. Some might be particularly interested in the methodological aspects of studies. Some are just interested in going to things to get bright ideas on how they could take things home to make a difference in practice. We know that lots of you want more clinical content. And so I'm going to really encourage you to submit clinical-based abstracts, because that's how we're going to increase the amount of clinical content that is robust and original. But as a scientific committee, we're going to be looking at all those abstracts, all the scores for the abstracts, to make sure that it's balanced to meet those range of needs. So whatever your interest is, you should find something for you at the EAPC Congress. What do we prioritise? Well, actually, we don't give priority to any type of abstract. I don't care whether it's qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, whether it's a systematically constructed a review, it's your non-empirical work. They are all equally valued. And what we are trying to do is evaluate each abstract on its own merits based on the most appropriate way of understanding that type of work. So, for example, a trial or a cohort study will often have hundreds, if not thousands, of participants. A qualitative study might have 10, 15, 20, 25 participants. There is no way that we would want a reviewer to say that that is too small a sample size. if the abstract writer has clearly demonstrated that that sample size was appropriate to answer the question posed and to enable robust findings to be produced and for the conclusions of that to be appropriate. So don't think, oh, I can't put something in because they're just looking for these huge international studies. We're not. We don't prioritize any sort of abstract. We're looking for the best possible abstracts within, for example, all of those types. I've given methodological types here, but clearly we have strands of work relevant to different topics as well. So how are we going to score these? Well, we've worked hard as a scientific committee to look at the previous scoring systems and to develop a new scoring system for this conference. So if you have been involved in reviewing previously for the EAPC, what I'm about to show you will look very different. And we put a lot of work into it. So being a researcher, obviously, I went and looked at the research, and there is research, unsurprisingly, on how to score conference abstracts in terms of what worked best in terms of trying to identify the highest possible quality of abstract whilst trying to make it not too onerous for the reviewer. So what we have come up with is a scoring system across a number of components, but where you as a reviewer will only be asked to put in a single score. So you will put in a single numerical score. And we know that the available top score for an empirical abstract is different to the available top score for a non-empirical abstract. But because they are submitted separately and we know what sort of abstracts they are, we can take account of that. So when I show you this scoring system, don't worry that for some things a non-empirical abstract scores perhaps 0 or very lowly. They will not be assessed alongside the empirical abstracts. So these are the first two areas that we are asking our reviewers to look at. The first is about the background or context of the study or work. So here, is the need for the study well described in terms of what is known, what is not known, and the purpose, the things clearly that I have already articulated earlier on in terms of what you need to look at when you're thinking of writing your abstract. And you can see here there is a score from 1 to 4. So as a reviewer, you'll be thinking, okay, yeah, it's well articulated, but I think it's more a sort of only in the sort of national, perhaps slightly international context. This might be a 3. Now, clearly, I've already intimated that I might look at the work and say it's a 3. Somebody else might look at the work and say it's a 4. That is not a problem, because the more reviewers we'll have, the more that innate sort of difference between us when we look at work will be evened out across all of the reviewers. Next, we're going to be looking at the clarity of your objectives or your purpose. Is it clear what the purpose of this work is? So, and we've emphasised that for empirical abstracts, this might be exploratory, descriptive, or hypothesis testing. We equally value each of those as long as it's appropriate to the question that's asked and the methods that are then presented. You can see here there are scores for non-empirical abstracts. So again, if you are presenting an abstract or assessing an abstract that is about, say, a new service development, it still has to have a well thought out purpose, and we will score against that purpose. You can also see here that we have weighted some of the scores. So if you look at this, the scores for some of these are weighted. So, and that is because we could have an abstract which, when you look at some of the later scores, is really relevant to palliative care. So it scores highly there, but is actually has a poor objective and poor methods. So, and you could see from the research in this field that it was very important to weight some of the things that we want to see as particularly important to ensure that we are presenting not just relevant work, but robust work. The next two elements are about the research approach to address the question and the relevance of this work. And again, you can see some different scoring here. So clearly for a non-empirical abstract, we're not expecting you to give us a choice of research approach. But for the research abstracts, you can see again that we are weighting as more important a really clear design, highly relevant to answering the question posed. There's nothing ambiguous in the way that you have described it. For relevance, however, equally against our empirical and non-empirical abstracts, where we want to see ideally highly relevant results for palliative care, likely to change policy, research, or practice. So again, you can see the sorts of things that we're starting to look at and how this is going to calculate into an overall score. We ask, is the study original? Is it relevant to the conference theme? And is it clearly presented? So again, the clarity of presentation is some of the things that we've already been talking about in terms of how you might construct your abstract. But do also think about this particular conference, Helsinki next year, and how you can make it particularly clear that the work that you have done is relevant to the conference themes that you are suggesting that this work is assigned to. And clearly we're looking for, highly original work where possible, and that clearly will gain a much higher score. So to do that, we need you. We need you as reviewers and abstract reviewers. And I'm hoping that as a result of the conversation today, that you might think, oh gosh, actually, I could do this, or actually, it would be really useful for my development needs to do this. As a reassurance, the scoring scheme that I have just outlined will be available shortly after the webinar on the EAPC abstract submission website. We want to be absolutely explicit about the scores that we are looking for and how we're going to score it. There's no secret here. We're not scoring it against a top secret system that no one understands. We are explicitly talking about it today, and we will upload and make that available to people from today or, when it's uploaded onwards, so that you can absolutely see how we're going to score it. And as I've previously said, we're not constructing some sort of matrix of scores. And I think from previous experience of a similar scoring system for other conferences, I just have a very quick running tally on my desk. Oh, that's a 3, a 2, a 6, a 4. Okay, that adds up to, 52 or whatever. And that's all you have to put in. We're not asking you to put in very complex composite scores. But we hope that this clarity and this shared understanding means that we have a higher quality of assessment of the abstracts that are going to be submitted, and hence, hopefully, as we articulated right at the very beginning, a much higher quality overall, and a fantastic conference for everybody that comes to Helsinki. So I'm going to stop there. And we've still got some time for discussion. So I sort of said I'd talk for about an hour, 3/4 of an hour, and leave plenty of time for people to ask questions. So I'll open up the chat. But again, I don't know, Kathy, if you've been keeping an eye on any of the questions that might come in or anything that's particularly important that I ought to be addressing.
Yes, thanks, Catherine. And just to remind people, please put any questions that you have in the Q&A. There were a couple of things that I noticed coming up on the chat. One thing people are asking, is it possible to get your slides, Catherine?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
Okay, perfect. So we'll figure out how best to share those. Thank you. Jan from Denmark was asking, what about mentioning the name of the context of, so you were saying about not mentioning the country. And so he was wondering about the sort of like, the type of setting.
I mean, ultimately, we do this. The abstract, and I can see that was one of the questions as well. As a reviewer, the abstracts are blinded. So you do not know who has submitted the abstract, their institution, or their names, or their country. So they are, as much as possible, blinded. That's not the reason, however, why I suggest don't put the country in the title. So it's not about blinding. You can, of course, put the country in the methods. So I would quite clearly say, a study conducted in the the Danish something system. There's absolutely no reason not to say that it was conducted in Denmark or the UK or Portugal or wherever. It's not for the blinding purposes. I said it's just because we want to emphasize the international relevance of the work that we're doing. It's not for blinding purposes. But what I would say is that as a reviewer, yes, it is blinded. Occasionally, of course, you can work out who submitted the abstract, particularly for some large, well-known studies that might have presented previous work. It's not so hard to work out sometimes who did it, and that's life. We can't avoid that. But wherever possible, yes, they are blinded, and we obviously will be trying to pay as much attention as possible within the submission systems to send you papers where we think, or abstracts where we think you don't have a conflict of interest. But we're only really basing that off, say, for example, the institution in which you're based or whatever. We don't know everything about you and all the projects that you work on. So we just ask people to be honest. And if you are sent something where there is a conflict of interest, then you obviously declare it and you can knock it back in the system and then get assigned something else to look at.
So actually just picking up on that, Joanna's point about the fact that abstracts are blinded, and I guess it may be that you genuinely don't know that you do have a conflict of interest because the abstract is blind to you. So I guess that situation could happen, and as a blinded reviewer, there isn't really a conflict with that at all, is there?
No. I mean, people will not know who has reviewed their papers, and I'm sure over the years I've probably reviewed a paper of somebody that I might have worked with, but I've had no idea that it's been their paper, so I've been able to judge it, on a dispassionate, basis, based obviously on a reasonable score.
Thanks, Catherine. So just in terms of picking up again on a couple of questions that have come in, a query around should your title have a subtitle for your abstract?
My question would be, I don't know where you're going to fit that into the to the word count that you've got. So no, it doesn't need to have a subtitle. Some of the most informative titles do use devices such as a colon to add some extra information. So for my hypothetical example, it could be, a study of, inappropriate admissions of people with COPD to acute hospitals, colon, a randomized controlled trial. And so that gives quite a lot of information, but it's not a subtitle. There's no separate space for a subtitle within the abstract submission space.
And just picking up that people are asking as well about, was this being recorded? Maybe people who arrived a bit late. Yes, it's being recorded and will be made available after today's session. Just in terms of, again, there were some queries about a plan on submitting an abstract. Is that a problem being a reviewer? I think that's been very well covered. Yep. Absolutely no problem. Can we submit scholarly work, not research, as an abstract?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by scholarly work. So yes, you can submit systematically constructed reviews. as scholarly work. They will be scored using exactly the same system as the research abstracts, because as far as I'm concerned, a systematically constructed review is a piece of research. It should have been done in a robust, reproducible fashion. If you have not done a systematically constructed review and you want to submit something that's more a sort of a narrative overview of an area, I sadly would suggest that that actually will be scored relatively lowly and is unlikely to be selected, or at least selected very highly. So, but if by scholarly work you mean the non-empirical abstracts, we are expecting those to be much more clinical in focus, perhaps. It's giving people a real space to share some of their clinical innovations that they may well not have a research evidence base for, but do perhaps have some robust audit or service evaluation data that they're able to then share that with us. And I think people will be very interested in that context.
A question about if we want to serve as abstract reviewers, do we need to register again? If you registered or if you were a reviewer last year with us, we will be sending out an email to all of those reviewers from last year. If you reviewed before that year, then yes, I would suggest do register. And I put the link in the chat for people so that they can register themselves. And if you register twice, we will consolidate the list anyway. So there's no harm in that. It isn't necessary to share your curriculum vitae. There isn't a selection process. And maybe, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that, Catherine, just in terms of our...
No, I mean, we have hundreds of reviewers. It's, you know, it's just not possible to assess somebody's ability to contribute to the process. But, you know, if you are involved in palliative care provision, involved in palliative care evaluation, involved in palliative care research, I'm pretty darn sure that you will have the skills to be a reviewer with the criteria that we've given you. So we don't have, you know, you don't have to have a PhD, you don't have to have a master's degree. We have not set those sorts of criteria. It's a very open process. And clearly by, you know, allocating reviewers and as many reviewers as possible to review a single abstract means that we are bringing in all of that different expertise to bear in assessing a single abstract.
Thank you. A question, and it's slightly tangential, someone asking about if the results of any of the studies are meant for policy decision-making processes. I don't know if they're saying that as a policy maker or someone who wants to influence it.
So what we're interested in, and when you look again at the scoring system when that's released, you'll see that we say it has to be relevant to palliative care practice, to palliative care policy, to palliative care theory, to palliative care research methods. An abstract could address any one of those four things. So if you want to make some particular conclusions on the basis of the work that you have done that are particularly aimed at policymakers, fantastic, because obviously policymakers are a really important audience for us.
How can someone improve their chance of being invited for an oral presentation instead of a poster presentation?
Write a fantastic abstract. I know that sounds mad. You've seen the scoring system now. The top scoring abstracts are the ones that are considered for oral presentation. So your sole job is to be at the top of that pile. So that's why we have been absolutely explicit with the criteria that we have used. And I would strongly suggest you sit there writing your abstract with the criteria in front of you, mentally ticking off whether you've achieved those. And the more of those that you think you can score as highly as possible, then the bigger the chance of you getting an oral presentation at the conference. It's as simple as that. There are no other hidden criteria. It's have a great scoring abstract, and they are the ones that will be selected.
is there any requirement regarding acceptance of the study around the timing at which it took place? So is there the potential for an abstract to be accepted about a study that was carried out 10 years ago?
I would say that would score more lowly in terms of originality and relevance, because if the data are really quite old now, their ability to be relevant to contemporary palliative care policy and practice is probably more limited. So, yeah, of course you can submit it. You would need to make it really clear why you think the data remain relevant, but it may well be that the reviewers who are assessing that, it doesn't get as high a score because you won't be able to score it as highly on some of the aspects in the scoring system.
Thank you. I think all of the questions that have come in so far have been answered. I'm just checking if somebody's question got buried somewhere in the chat. Please do type it out again, because I've had a lot of chat going in, and actually thanks to my colleague Joanne, who's masquerading as me in the background and has been answering quite a few questions as well, just general questions. Will there be room at the conference for abstracts that are non-empirical and not evaluated so highly, but could be inspirational? For example, a program or a project conducted locally involving the general public, but lessons learned could be useful globally.
Yes. So I would strongly suggest that they are submitted in what we call non-empirical abstracts. But you need to then think about the scoring for the non-empirical abstracts and how you're going to write that with real clarity. Because of course we want something that's inspirational, and of course we want you to make it clear that the learning from a local program could be globally relevant. Of course, everything starts locally somewhere. So I think that is really important to say. But ideally, we would want to know not only that there's an inspirational program or project, but actually, have you assessed the impact of that? Because if you can demonstrate that it is both inspired people locally, but also you have demonstrated the impact, and you can write about how you've demonstrated that impact and the results of that evaluation, I would suggest that's going to score really highly as a non-empirical abstract, and that's a very strong opportunity for being selected. So yes, there is absolutely room at the conference for that sort of work, but just be really careful when you're submitting your abstracts. There are these two very clear strands and you have to make sure that you are submitting it to the right strand, because if you don't, it's going to get improperly assessed because it'll be in the wrong strand, as it were.
Do people get a certificate of having been reviewers for the conference? I know that they will get a mention in the abstract, but I don't think there is a certificate. My colleague Joanne, who is in the background, would know that better. I have a feeling not, but you do get, so you get
acknowledge all the reviewers, yes.
So all of our abstracts are published in the journal, or our palliative medicine journal. Is that acknowledgement in the palliative medicine journal as well, Catherine, or is it in the front of
the program book with all the abstracts is published in palliative medicine, and typically I think the last few pages of that names or perhaps it's at the beginning, it's somewhere anyway, names the people who have acted as a reviewer. Yes, for sure. So it will certainly be published. It'll be published in the abstract book. And clearly we want to acknowledge you as well. You're going to be really important to the whole success of the Congress.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a question that came in the questions that were submitted ahead of registration. What are the advantages of being part of EAPC in academic terms? Which is an interesting one. I'm assuming that's what they're saying. What are the advantages of being part of the company or organization in academic terms? So I guess maybe what they're meaning is the value of being a reviewer. And I think some of that you covered about how it's very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's several layers to that because clearly, as an academic myself, I find huge value in being a reviewer because it helps my development as an academic. It exposes me to other people's work in a way that reading the abstract doesn't, because you're reading it with a different set of eyes. It helps me to see perhaps a wider range of abstract and learn from that. But then I think when, you actually then go to the Congress, for me, the EAPC is the main conference that I go to other conferences in the year, but the EAPC is the main conference because that is the main place where I will meet with like-minded colleagues and share contemporary current work with them from across and beyond Europe. So for me, it's the top conference to go to. And not just because Helsinki is lovely, but we've been there. Helsinki is absolutely lovely, but because actually it's going to be a fantastic opportunity to interact and learn from such a wide variety of people.
And I mean, just to say, as a plug for the EAPC, being a member of the EAPC, if you're a member of one of our national organizations, you can join the EAPC for free. Or you can join as an individual member if you're not one of those National Association members. And generally, the membership fee is less than the reduction in Congress fee. You get a reduced Congress fee that more than makes up for that membership. So not only do you get to be a member and avail of all the member opportunities, but also a reduction in the Congress fee. So it's a win-win, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm just checking if there was anything else that is coming up. How will the abstracts be assigned to a reviewer? How many, and generally how much time? So I think you did.
So when you register as a reviewer, you are asked which of the themes of the conference you might have a particular interest in reviewing abstracts against. So we have a number of conference sub-themes, and you can tick as many or as few of those as you like. There's no restriction, I think. So have a look at those. Decide which are your particular areas of interest, because clearly what we want is reviewers who are interested in and can understand, that particular topic, say pediatrics or something like that. So we're trying to send abstracts to those who are particularly interested in that topic area. So that's the first thing. There are some topic areas that are more popular than others in terms of the number of abstracts that we receive. But on the other hand, I think they tend to be also more popular with the reviewers. So, we'll probably have a reasonable balance, but you might potentially be asked to occasionally review something that you feel is outside your particular sphere of interest, in which case you can either accept to review that or knock it back into the system and say, look, I just don't feel I can assess this, and we will find another reviewer. So, but within those thematic things, they are pretty much assigned randomly once any conflicts of interest have, obvious conflicts of interest have been dealt with. And as I said earlier, in previous years, people have got something like 10, 15 or so abstracts. And in the chat earlier, I think Joanne was busy answering questions to say that there's about a month roughly to review the abstracts. So they're allocated at the beginning of November, and we're asking for the scores to be in by the end of November. And that's because we have a scientific committee meeting the first week in December, where we'll be actually looking at those scores. So that is a really hard deadline again, because we obviously need all those scores in to be able to start to construct the programme from the highest scoring abstracts. So again, within that month, 3 or 4 weeks that you're allocated to do the abstracts, I mean, we are thinking, I normally do it in an afternoon, probably less than that, to be honest, but I've done it for quite a few years now. For somebody who is new to reviewing, certainly less than a day's work, probably an afternoon or a morning's work, I suspect, within that 3 or 4 week period.
Yeah, somebody was just checking because they said the form that I've asked them to complete doesn't say about their interest, but actually that is part of the next step. So at the moment, we're just asking for expressions of interest. We will then be getting you to complete a registration onto our abstract submission system, and it's at that point where it starts to clarify exactly what your areas of interest are. So at the moment, this is just about saying, yes, I'm willing to be an abstract reviewer, and more process will follow. Someone is asking, can they have the ID of everyone who's present? Unfortunately not, from a data governance point of view, sorry. But they've shared their email with everyone if people want to connect with them. Someone asking about the evaluation form. I'm going to share a slide shortly, which will give you that information about getting the evaluation form and getting a certificate for today's session. If you have to leave very quickly, that will be sent out to you anyway in a follow-up email that's coming after this session. So just checking if there's any other issues. No, I don't think. I think we've got through everything. Catherine, thank you so much for today's session. It's hugely informative. Obviously, you've got lots and lots of interest from the group today, and we had roughly 100 people who were here. So as I say, it just shows how much interest there is. We're delighted to have you all on board. As Catherine said, everybody is welcome. There's, just showing that you were interested is sufficient, for us. We're very, very happy to work with you, and really happy to see you submitting your abstracts as well. So I am just going to share this final slide. And Catherine, are there any just final thoughts from you as we close?
No, I don't think so. I'm just really looking forward to seeing your fantastic abstracts and to having a really robust process, so we choose the very best ones to share with you in Helsinki. Thank you.